Hey everybody, and welcome back to our YouTube channel. Today I'd like to talk to you about plant styling. So it's all about making your plants look as good as possible. I started my plant hobby because I wanted to grow large statement pieces that I can put in my apartment that kind of transform the apartment from being a little bit boring and lifeless to being like an indoor jungle, right? Now, I know that that's not everybody's motivation behind a plant hobby. Some people are genuinely interested in, the nature of it all and understanding how nature works and so on. And don't get me wrong, that's definitely also something I really appreciate. I love, for example, looking at species and hybrids and looking at their differences and what they've got in common and so on. But my number one motivator behind my plant collection is definitely just creating an aesthetically pleasing display of plants that really enhance the look of my apartment. So, whenever I grow something, all of my growing approaches and everything I really do definitely has my end goal in mind. I want my plants to look nice. Now, for plants to look nice, of course, you need to make them thrive, And I've spoken plenty about how to actually make them thrive before. So if you're not familiar with any of my previous videos, I'll link a couple of playlists at the end screen so you can look at all of my growth tips and tutorials. Now, let's assume that we are growing our plants really well and they're thriving, they're throwing out new leaves. What else can we do to really make them look as good as possible? How can we guide them from, a nice plant to really being a huge statement piece? There's a couple of things that we can do. Now, first of all, we need to obviously consider what is aesthetically pleasing to you. Like that might not necessarily mean the same as with me. So I've heard people that say they really hate the look of my moss poles, for example, or moss poles in general, not mine specifically. If you don't like the look of moss poles, then maybe going with moss poles isn't the right thing to do for you. If looks are important to you, right? I personally much prefer the look of a moss pole over like any sort of inorganic material like a stake or like a PVC pipe. I do personally I do like the look of a wooden pole, when you have not one of these wooden planks that you would use for construction, but like one of these real iron bark planks. I think they look really nice. They look as close as possible to nature. So I really like them, but the functionality isn't really there. And ultimately, I want my plant to look nice, not the support. The goal is for the support to kind of disappear behind the plant. So I personally don't mind, but just keep in mind that, everybody has personal preferences. So that's definitely not a tutorial over here. I'm just saying what I've done to make my plants look nice. And you can take any sort of tips and tricks away from it if you want, or you can just absolutely leave it the way that you're currently doing it. I don't care. All right, so the first thing I do is I obviously need to keep in mind how my plants like to naturally grow. So most of my plants are climbers, so I'm giving them a support so they can climb and mature and grow as large as possible. And of course, whenever you have leaves, these leaves will seek sunlight. So these leaves will automatically kind of point towards the sun. My goal is for all of the leaves to kind of point in one direction because I've got them sitting against a wall. There's absolutely no point in having leaves facing the wall. They wouldn't naturally face the wall anyway. They would like to they will always seek light. But if you happen to rotate your plants every week or so, eventually you have leaves facing in all directions. It might look great if you have it sitting in the middle of the room and you want the pole to be filled 360 degrees, but I'd rather have all of the leaves face one way so that from the front it gives you like a really nice display side and the back side is just purely functional. To me, it's a waste of leaves if they would be facing backwards. Now, for a plant to grow up quite nicely and straight up its pole, ideally you would want the light. Hey, Brad. Ideally, you would want the light source to be right in front of it. So, for example, I have plants right in front of my balcony windows. And that basically means that the light is coming from the front, so all leaves will face to the front and face kind of flat down as well. So it looks really nice from a display perspective. If your light source would come from the top, which is really hard to achieve in an indoor setting unless you're using grow lights, then of course leaves would be facing more upwards. The leaves will kind of face towards your light source, which means that I'm having a challenge with these plants behind me because the light source is definitely predominantly from the right-hand side. It gets a little bit more light in the afternoon from the left as well, so that kind of helps balancing it out a little bit. But to be honest, what I actually do, and sorry, my poles are usually facing kind of this way. So I have them kind of on an angle towards the window so that the plant can still grow up fairly straight. It's just not quite as nice to look at for me personally. So I do that in the plant's best interest, but whenever I take, you know, a video recording for you guys, I obviously want to show the best side of these plants. So I just rotate it forward. So yeah, sorry, that was a real Instagram versus reality moment, but you know, that's life. Of course, I want to make my plants face the light, not necessarily face me all the time. All right, so other things in relation to light, if, for example, you do not want to put your plant on a little angle, you want to have it facing straight, but the light is coming from one side, then eventually the leaves will all kind of start pointing one side, right? So what you can do is just rearrange and put it somewhere else where the light source is coming from the left. So over time, the leaves will kind of correct themselves. I'll talk about it a little bit more later on in this video when I show you my overall setup. All right, the next thing I do is I kind of tell my plant whereabouts I want it to grow. So it grows uniformly and straight up the pole ideally. So I have this piece of wire, and it's really just the wire that came with the mesh. So the mesh was kind of wrapped in this wire. So I'm just repurposing it. I'm just cutting little bits out of it, shaping it into a U. And then where I have new growth, let's say this one, and it's kind of leaning a bit towards the right-hand side because there's more light coming from the right, I'll just take it, I'll kind of move the node to where I want it to be, and then I use the moss pole or the wire mesh of that moss pole like a little grid and just bloop, kind of pin it to where I want it to be. Now, of course, that node is eventually going to grow nodes. Once it has attached, then I remove the pin and I put it onto that next node and so on. I don't do that with all of my plants. Most of my plants grow straight up kind of by themselves or mainly based on the light exposure. They do it by themselves. So I really just need to do it with the plants that are getting very one-sided light. That's where I'm trying to kind of push it back a little bit so it doesn't lean towards one side. What I'm trying to avoid is that my plant kind of wraps around its moss pole. Then you have leaves facing in all directions, and ultimately I want to push it towards the wall. First of all, to save space. If all of my plants have to be like a meter removed from the wall because there's leaves everywhere, well, I'm kind of running out of space to even walk in this apartment. So I need to save space, but also, well, I want one side to look really nice. I want it to look great, right? I want that moss pole to disappear. So the more leaves I've got on one side, the more likely I will be able to cover the entire pole. Okay, so that's kind of all about light. So basically learning about whereabouts the light comes from, seeing how your plant naturally adjusts to the light exposure, and then you kind of manipulating the plant to kind of work in the way that you want it to work. The second thing I do is, and I do that specifically with very large plants, once you get really large plants with long petioles, and I show you the example of my Cupria and of my Glorious. Once they start having really long petioles or a lot of leaves, they can spread and kind of just take up, number one, a lot of space, but also might not look as great, right? So, I mean, this plant looks awesome, but some of these leaves getting a little droopy, I reckon just purely because they're so heavy. So wouldn't it look much nicer if it was like a little compact bouquet like this? Well, in my opinion, yes, it would. So what I do is I just take a little stake and I pop that in the back, and that's kind of just my stake for me to anchor all of my my twines on in a sec. Then I use twine. Obviously, I only use the stake because this one isn't on a moss pole already. If it was on a moss pole, then I would just use the moss pole instead of a stake. I use a bit of twine. The reason I use twine is because it's really soft, so it won't really harm the petioles of the plant, and it looks nice and natural, right? So I absolutely hate these Velcro, these green Velcro ties. I know they're probably really useful and you can easily reuse them, but I just think they're, I don't know, to me it doesn't make any sense. As I said, this video is all about aesthetics, so no thank you, neon green Velcro tape. I rather go with a more natural looking option. So basically all I do is, and I'll show you a close-up of what it looks like when it's done, but I just basically tie a knot to the petiole. I'll take the twine and then I just kind of put that onto the stake. at the height that I want it to be in. Next one, right? And honestly, there's absolutely no method to my madness. Sometimes I just connect petioles to each other. Sometimes I connect the petioles to the stake first and then to each other. Sometimes I don't connect it at all. The twine is also not going to be a forever solution, right? Especially if the twine starts getting wet, the twine is kind of going to break eventually, which isn't a bad thing because your plant changes over time as well. Your plant is not going to look the same forever. So as your kind of plant changes due to light or due to whatever, then eventually you might just want to redo the whole look of it anyway, and then that's it. Yeah, so I kind of probably redo that every, I don't know, 2 to 3 months, just because the plant is moving. Now, I have no idea what this looks like from the front because I've done it all from the back, but it looks good from the back, right? And let me just cut off the excess. There you go. So you can see I just kind of connected all of the petioles together a little bit just to make it a little bit more compact so it doesn't spread out quite that far, to lift off these leaves that kind of were facing downwards a little bit. And I'm much happier with this now. Yeah. Alrighty, next up we've got my Philodendron Glorious. And with my Philodendron Glorious, I've done something very similar. Alright, I hope you can see this. I mean, look at this petiole. This petiole is huge, right? Look at this petiole. It goes all the way to here. So I really need to kind of tame this beast. Otherwise, it's going to spread so far. It's going to take up like a whole wall all by itself. So what I really just do is I take the twine, I tie it to the petiole, I tie it to the moss pole, or, you know, I tie 2 petioles kind of together and just connect it via the moss pole. Just so they're all a little bit closer to the pole, give it a nice compact lush look, and just save me a lot of space. It also stops it from being top heavy or front heavy, right? Imagine you have 5, 6 really long petioles with huge leaves attached to them going like a meter out from the pole. It would make it so top heavy. So this way I kind of just bring back the center point of gravity towards the pole to make it less likely to fall over. Now, because the twine is kind of touching the moss pole, this twine is more likely to eventually break because I keep the moss pole moist. But as I said before, the plant is constantly moving and changing anyway. So if that breaks in like a couple of months' time, that's totally fine. And I'll just redo it based on what the plant has changed into in the meantime. Right, so they're all tied up apart from that newest leaf over here, but I won't tie that up just yet because it's still maturing, so the petiole still has a little bit of growing to do. It's still not in its forever location, so I will just give it a little bit more time, and once it has fully matured, then I'll see where I kind of tie it up against. Now, when the stem gets a little bit thicker, it's going to be harder to manipulate the actual stem. So let me show you this down here, right? So this is just purely cosmetic what I've done. But you see how this stem was kind of crawling backwards? So it was kind of crawling away from the front of the pole where I want it to be. Now, these little U-shaped wires that I showed you before really only work if your petiole is if your stem is quite small, right? With a stem that thick, it's not going to work. So this one I actually cable tied to the pole, not to attach it because it attaches itself using its roots. I cable tied it to the part of the pole that I wanted to attach to. So it, you know, otherwise it might have kind of just spiraled around the pole, which I really wanted to avoid. I want all of these leaves to face forward, and obviously for the leaves to face forward, I need to have the stem of the plant face the front part of the pole as well, or attach itself to the front part of the pole. Alright, and the last thing I do on a plant by plant basis to make it look as nice as possible is I use decorative planters. Now, I think I need to lift it up. All right, I hope you can see that now. So all of my plants are in decorative planters. First of all, that decorative planter gives the roots shade, right? I love to use see-through pots, but I put the see-through pots into that decorative planter. Roots seek darkness. So the roots are much happier within that decorative planter, but also that decorative planter gives that pole stability. If it wasn't for the decorative planter, that pole would definitely fall over. It's way too top heavy for that small surface area or for that small footprint to actually keep it upright. But because the planter is quite heavy, it actually counterbalances that and stops it from being so top heavy. So it is very aesthetically pleasing in my opinion, and it's very functional as well. When it comes to planters, I pretty much stick to white, gray, black, and a little bit of green, even though I don't like the green planters that much. I think the contrast with the green leaves isn't just that great. So I stick to just really basic colors in planters, so the leaves in themselves really shine. And I think that also makes a huge impact on the way that your plants look. It just looks nice and polished. Oh my God, I'm gonna get so much hate for this video, but I also absolutely hate the look of terracotta. I think it looks really, I mean, it works for some aesthetics. I've seen some apartments and they use terracotta and it looks amazing. It kind of fits in with their aesthetic. But my aesthetic is very like modern, like basic almost. Like I feel like I want most of my apartment, all of the furniture, most of the items that I have in my apartment to be pretty basic, pretty bland, not too much of a statement piece, so that the plants can really shine, right? I'm just giving them like a plain canvas to really shine on, rather than just the apartment in itself being already absolutely filled with stuff and then the plants on top of it. Despite the fact that I have so many plants, my friends, when some of my friends visit, they actually said that it's not cluttered. They imagine it to be extremely cluttered when they come in, because they know how many plants I've got, but because I think I keep everything else to a minimum, I don't really have any other decoration but plants, it's still not coming across as cluttered. And honestly, more isn't always more. Sometimes having 2 or 3 large statement pieces on a wall actually have a much bigger impact than having a shelf with 350 tiny one-leaf cuttings, right? So, I mean, it really depends on what you're trying to achieve, but if you're trying to do an if you're trying to achieve an aesthetically pleasing home environment that works for you and your plants, then maybe just focus on a couple of plants and grow them really well, rather than just growing all the plants in the world and kind of not give any of them the attention and care that they really need. Anyway, alrighty, so all of this was kind of just step 1. In step 1, we really just focused on one individual plant, and we looked at how can we make that one individual plant how can we make that one plant look as aesthetically pleasing as possible. Step 2 is really grouping plants together so that they form a nice little collection of sort, or they form like an aesthetically pleasing display. The first option of grouping plants together is just grouping them within the same pot or within the same moss pile. The variegated Epipremnum pinnatum on my right, so your left, it has 2 shoots on it. So it's twice as full as if it would only have 1 shoot on it, right? So you can group plants, and you can also group different plants on the same moss pile. I personally don't. I rather just have multiple vines of the same plant on one moss pile to create a lush display. But I've seen people mix different types of pothos or different types of monsteras just to add a bit of different textures, different colors onto one pole, and it looks absolutely stunning, right? So you can totally do that. There is no right or wrong, but that's kind of the first way of you kind of creating a display. The second part is, and I like the second way, and I've done that with that one over here as well. These syngoniums down at the bottom are actually planted separately. They're just all 3 stuck into the same decorative planter. Same with this one over here. These are all planted individually. Sorry, this one. They're all planted individually, right? So they're all in their own individual pots, so I can take care of each of these individually, move them around, I can rotate them so that they can all look nice. I can water them separately or treat them for spider mites separately as required, but I then put them into one large planter to kind of create a display. And when I do something like that, I usually try and choose plants that are similar but different. So this one is kind of like, the overarching theme is kind of like jewel alocasia, right? They all look like little dragon leaves, you know, and they're all similar in height, they're similar in size, but they have different textures, different colors. And I think overall it just creates like a nice display. But you can also totally mix different textures and different heights and so on. You can have something trailing, something kind of a more bushy, and something climbing, all within one pot, for example, to create a little bit of interest. So that's absolutely up to you. And yeah, I didn't study any of this, so I don't want to give you too many. I'm not saying there's something you should be doing and you shouldn't be doing. This is just my approach. I like to group things that are kind of similar, rather than just grouping things of the opposite together. The next thing you can do to create a nice display of plants is implement the rule of threes, or the rule of odds. So basically that means that if you want to group things together, an odd number usually works the best from an aesthetic perspective. So have 3 different plants in 3 planters, and group them together, make a nice display out of them, or 5 and so on. 2 or 4 kind of looks a little bit odd. So odd numbers makes it look less odd, if that makes sense. So I personally am not the best at implementing that rule because I just have so many plants. I don't know, I can't really afford to keep them to 3 or 5 or so on. It's just like a continuous display at this stage. There are no little islands or little pockets of plants. It's more like just every surface is filled. Ultimately, your aesthetics are unique to you, and all you need to do is just really make sure that it works for you. So I really just wanted to share with you what I do to make my plants look nice. And hopefully some of these tips and tricks work for you. Now that we looked at each plant individually and we learned what we can do to make that one plant look nice, and we also looked at how we can group them together to create an aesthetically pleasing display, let's look at the overall setup and how I kind of deal with these things in my living area. Right. So let's have a look at my entire living area and let's talk about how I styled my living area. So first and foremost, this is my living area. I need to live in here, so I want to make it comfortable and I want to make it livable. I do not want to turn this into a grow tent, right? It's supposed to be like an urban jungle, but definitely still have an urban part to it, right? So it's very different if you grow in an indoor environment compared to growing in a growth tent or in a greenhouse. Like if I had a garden, I would definitely build a greenhouse, just chuck all my plants in there, hang them from the ceiling and just shower them, right? Really easy. But in an indoor environment, of course, it's not quite that easy. First of all, the plants don't get as much light because we've got a ceiling above us. And second of all, it's usually much drier, and obviously I need to protect the floor and the apartment as well. I need to make it livable for myself, and I don't want to live in a grow tent. So first and foremost, this needs to work for me. So I want a couch, I want a TV, I want a table, and so on. And then my plants need to really fit around me, but it's kind of a compromise, right? So what I kind of came up with is that the areas near the windows or the areas near the walls is kind of reserved for most of the plants. And as we move more into the actual room itself, so where you get the least light, that's kind of where I have my items, my furniture, right? So kind of where the couch is at the moment, that's kind of one of the darkest areas in the whole apartment. Where the table is actually, it's too light. In summer, it gets absolutely scorched with sun over here. So that's where I kind of put the table. So no plant has to suffer and go through that. But it's really important for me to find a compromise, right? Of course, there's no point in me wanting to, or getting all of these plants and then putting them in a corner that doesn't suit them, right? If I don't give them enough light, they're not going to grow. So I'm not really going to achieve that good looking result that I'm after. So I do need to give them enough light, but I also don't want to turn my apartment into like a factory, or like I don't want to turn it into a growth tent with like grow lights everywhere and humidifiers and cables everywhere and like shelving and so on. I want it to be aesthetically pleasing. I want to be able to invite people over and I want them to feel comfortable. I don't want them to think they're in a grow tent or something like that, right? So to achieve that sort of compromise, I'm being very selective with what plants I'm actually growing. So these need to be plants that are happy with the natural conditions I've got to offer over here. I do not use a humidifier. All I really use is I use a heater in winter when I'm cold, but it's mainly because I'm cold. I don't want to be cold in my own home, so I have a heater, and then obviously the plants get to enjoy the mild temperatures as well, or the higher temperatures as well. Apart from that, all I really do is like I open the windows for airflow, and that's it. I take advantage of the natural light and the natural humidity that Sydney has got to offer, which at times can be really high, right? So we've had a couple of weeks of just rain and the humidity was kind of at 90% non-stop, but there was no light. And then as soon as it stops raining and the sun comes out, you have a lot of light, but the humidity can drop really quickly down to like 30, 40, 50%. So there's quite a lot of fluctuations in humidity, temperature, as well as light levels. But, you know, that's the best I can do. So I choose plants, or let's say over the last 3 years or so, I found out what plants actually work with that environment the best. And those are the ones that I kept. If there's any plants that are just not appreciating, if there's plants that are not appreciating the environment that I've got to offer, then it's not my fault. It's not the environment's fault. It's on the plant. So it has to go, right? I don't want this to be more work than it already is, right? I'm already spending quite a lot of time taking care of all my plants, checking for pests, you know, creating a lot of content and so on as well. I don't need any problem plants that, you know, make life harder than it absolutely has to be. So, you know, there's not going to be any caletheas in my apartment, that's for sure. It's just not worth the effort for me. But the plants that I have found that thrive in my environment quite well are pretty much, you know, climbing aeroids. Especially monsteras and pothos. They're doing really well in this living area. My velvet philodendron I kind of all have in my bedroom, which where I can control the environment a little bit better just due to the size of the room. So out here, you know, I kind of all my alocasias, all my monsteras, and all of my non-velvet philos are, and all of my pothos, like epipremnums, they're all in this living area. And they seem to be enjoying it, right? So, yeah, so that's kind of just how my approach, you know, obviously you can say that I don't really care about my natural environment. I rather supplement the environment and get the plants that I really want. So yeah, you can get yourself a queen anthurium, hang it on your wall and try and make your apartment 90% humidity at all times. But I just feel like it would get a little bit uncomfortable and it's probably not a good option for the sake of your apartment either. So, you know, urban jungles come with some sort of limitations if, you know, but it is what it is. I'm definitely waffling on and I'm kind of missing my point now. So what I really wanted to talk about is the light exposure, because the light exposure really dictates the way that I arrange my plants. So at the moment, it's kind of winter going into spring. So the sun is really low. We've got so north is exactly behind me. So this window over here is kind of northeast facing. So the sun kind of rises over here. And then because it's winter, the sun is pretty low all day long, right? So it kind of just goes like this, and then kind of sets somewhere over here, which means that during sunrise and sunset, the sun is actually really low. And the sun coming through this window hits that back wall, and the sun coming from this window hits this back wall. So in winter, I have the entire room available because all of the room gets quite a lot of bright light. Not so indirect, but because the sun is not that strong during winter, I don't mind them getting a little bit of direct sun, especially if it's sunset and sunrise and not in the middle of the day anyway. So during winter, I've got a whole lot of room available. Even these plants that are quite far away from a window get plenty of afternoon light when the sun comes in through this way. Whereas in summer, sun still rises over there and still sets over there, but in between it rises much higher up in the sky, right? Which means that even during sunrise and sunset, I of course get a little bit of direct sun coming in at the very early, but it kind of disappears pretty quickly. But I get a lot more bright indirect light and I get more sunlight hours, of course, right? So during summer, I can't actually have plants directly in front of the windows because it gets too hot, but I can probably have them like a meter and a half removed from the windows. And that's like the perfect prime spot for bright indirect light. But further back into the room actually gets way less light than it would get during winter because the sun is much higher. So I'm already working on a spring summer setup. So I'm probably gonna, you know, sun is still pretty low at the moment, but maybe if it goes, maybe mid-September or so, I really need to start thinking about rearranging my apartment to work with the changing conditions. Now, I'm not saying you have to. I actually really love rearranging my apartment. It's almost like you're moving house without having to move because everything looks different. I've always been doing that. Even when I was a little kid, I'm just like rearranging my my room, like, you know, rejiggling all of my posters that I have on the wall, and I feel like, oh my God, I renovated. Anyway, one day I definitely want to buy a house with a nice garden, build a greenhouse, and just renovate the whole place. Like, that's definitely like one of my lifelong dreams. But in the meantime, while I'm still renting, I'm just gonna rearrange my furniture and kind of feel good about myself after I've done that. Anyway, when I do rearrange, I'll definitely take you along and, you know, film it, time-lapse it or something like that. Now, when I rearrange, first of all, I take into consideration the changing in light exposure, but also what I take into consideration is whereabouts the plant used to be. So these plants on my wall over here, you know, they're all getting light from a window that's kind of on the right-hand side of them. So eventually the leaves will just kind of start tilting towards the right. So when I rearrange, I might just switch it to the opposite wall. So now the window is coming from the left-hand side. So over time, the leaves kind of start correcting themselves again and hopefully start pointing forward again, right? So I do that quite a bit, just switching plants around. Not all of them. Some of them don't seem to be moving too much to one side or the other. But if I feel like I'm not happy with the way a plant is growing, or if I'm not happy with the way that the leaves are facing, I just change the exposure, the light exposure, and where the light exposure is coming from. So it kind of redirects itself to make it look aesthetically pleasing. Because as much as I hate to say it, this video is probably the most superficial out of all the videos I've done. It's just all about making your plants look nice. I think that's it. I probably forgot to mention something, but yeah, anyway, back to other yarn. And that really concludes today's video. I hope you really enjoyed it, and I hope you got a few tips and tricks from this video that you can implement in your own plant journey and make your plants look as beautiful as possible. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you in my next video. Take care.